Welcome back to my channel. This week I'm starting a brand new series. The series is about the name statistics argument and some recent criticisms of it. This is an argument for the reliability of the Gospels. It's just one argument of many. It's not meant to carry things all by itself, but it is meant to have sufficient evidential weight to at least be worth noting. So what I'm going to do in this video is introduce the series by introducing the argument, just in case you haven't heard it, give a brief overview of that argument, and then briefly introduce the nature of the critique that has been recently published against this argument. So that's all I'm going to do today. There'll maybe be a little bit of a hint of the direction I'm going to go in my first response video. The first response video will be next time. To kick things off, the name statistics argument for the historical reliability of the Gospels as one part of a larger cumulative case was really given prominence, and I think originated by the scholar Richard Bauckham in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And in his second edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he responds to some critiques that had been brought at that time against the argument. So it's often associated with Bauckham. Peter J. Williams refers to it in his book, Can We Trust the Gospels? The scholar Luc Vandevey has published some articles using the argument, and I've mentioned the argument in my most recent book. Actually, I've got a little section on it that is very similar to Peter Williams's use of it in my recent book, Testimonies to the Truth. So several of us have put forward this argument, but it goes back originally to Bauckham. In very broad terms, here's how it goes. You may have noticed when you read the Gospels and the book of Acts that there are some names that turn up repeatedly, far more often than other names. Simon is a really good example here. We have Simon Peter. We also have Simon the leper. We also have Simon the Pharisee. We have Simon the tanner, and so forth, right? A lot of different Simons. We have Judas Iscariot. We also have Judas, son of James, who John refers to as Judas, not Iscariot. Okay, we have Joseph, the husband of Mary, and also Joseph Barsabbas, the latter being mentioned in the book of Acts. And so it goes, where you'll have multiple people with the same name, but they're clearly different people. This is among female names, especially noticeable with the name Mary. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and so forth. Okay, so you notice this, and then Bauckham has compared this to some name statistics data that were collected by an Israeli scholar named Tal Ilan. And she's not a Christian. She's interested in the history of the Jewish people. And so what she's done is to go back in different places, different times. She's looked on ossuaries, so like boxes for bones, inscriptions, literature, and so forth, and collected names, and then tabulated them according to their popularity in different times and different places in the history of the Jews. The largest collection comes from the region that's known as Palestine. That doesn't have any reference to contemporary conflicts in the Middle East. It's just the region that Christians think of as where Jesus had his ministry. It includes Judea, Galilee, that strip, that area right there, as opposed to the diaspora, which would include like Damascus in Syria or Alexandria in Egypt, and there were Jews living in those places as well. When Bauckham looked at the first volume of Ilan's work on this, which was what was out and concerned that region where Jews had lived for so many years, he noticed that the most popular names, you could especially see this with males, the most popular male names in that region at that time, according to Elon's data, were also the most popular ones, by and large, in the Gospels. And there's this kind of shape to the distribution. I'll be talking about this more in Elon and also in the Gospels, where it's like starting way up here and then it's going in sort of a swoopy shape, where you've got a lot of the individuals being named with relatively few names, and then it drops off fairly abruptly, and then you have, things where you only have a few incidents of less popular names. That's sometimes called a Pareto distribution or a Pareto-like distribution. And so you find this in both the Gospels and Acts put together when we consider people from that region, and in Elon's data. Bauckham also noticed that naming practices in Egypt, for example, were different, even among Jews, even before we bring in Gentile names, which I think a fabricator could have been using. I'll be talking about that in a later video. But even just looking at Jewish names, the naming practices were different. So Sabbateus, for example, was a popular male Jewish name in Egypt, but not in ancient Palestine and not in the Gospels, for example. And Bauckham points this out. Another aspect of the argument, which Bauckham mentions, and Peter Williams has, I think, even refined that argument further, concerns disambiguations. A disambiguation is, in its classic form, the addition of some extra information about a person that separates one person by that first name from another person by that first name. Of course, in the modern West, we use what we call last names. So if you've got two different people named Robert, they're going to have usually different last names. Okay? So that role was played by things like the person's job, Simon the Tanner, a nickname, Simon Peter, Peter meaning the rock, okay, that was a nickname that Jesus had given him, by a place that they were from, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Magdala, okay, or a relative, all right, so Judas, the son of James, Mary, the mother of Joseph, and so forth. Okay, so those are what we might call classic disambiguations. And what we find is, with only a couple of exceptions, I'll be talking about this in a whole video to itself later, the disambiguated names in the Gospels and Acts tend to be the most popular names at the time, as shown in independent data. This is true even when there is only one person by that name in the Gospels. Lazarus, for example, is called Lazarus of Bethany, a classic disambiguation, even though Lazarus is the only historical Lazarus. There's one in a parable of Jesus, but the only Lazarus presented as historical within the entirety of the Gospels and Acts. So the disambiguations fit together really well with the name statistics. This argument is, I think, strong. I mean, it has value. I'm not saying that we automatically just go, that's it, we get this name statistics matching, the whole Gospels and Acts are historical, that's it. It's not that crude, but it definitely has force worth mentioning. All the more so since it's unusual. Now, there are other kinds of external confirmations, and I would never downplay those. I use them. Bits of information about geography, bits of information about rulers, especially obscure rulers, customs, and so forth. Each of those refers to one fact. So like the fact that you go down to get from Cana to Capernaum. There's an example of an external confirmation. But this is what we might call a statistical fact. It's a fact about the shape of the names in the Gospels and Acts. As such, it's made up of a bunch of little individual decisions. And this is harder than you might think to get right. So if you think of it as a recipe, it would be difficult to say, oh, I think I need another pinch of Matthias. I'm going to use 4 tablespoons of Simon in order to, get enough Simons and so forth. Instead, it arises very organically out of the names, which are often associated with particular stories. So, for example, you have Simon the leper associated with the story of the woman who anointed Jesus' feet, right? So, that's just one of the stories. There's 2 of them, but that's just a story really more about her than about him. But he's named as the guy in whose house it took place. It just arises organically out of the story. And this happens over and over again. Okay, so we find that in the Gospels and in Acts, and it's harder than it might seem to get it right, because it's not just, okay, I'm gonna bring in this one thing that I found out here. Instead, it's a decision that they're making when they're reporting each story. So if they're making it up, they're making the decision, okay, I'm gonna make up another person named Judas or something like that. We also find that this happens with unique stories in the Gospels or unique aspects of the Gospels. Okay, so to give an example, the lists of the 12 are quite similar in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but they're not identical. Luke doesn't have Thaddeus. Thaddeus is in Matthew and Mark. But Luke does have someone that he names as Judas, son of James. Now, that's interesting, because if he's going to replace Thaddeus with somebody, why did he replace him with somebody named Judas if he was making it up? Especially if that's going to mean that he's going to have to bring in, another disambiguator, right? Oh, now I got another Judas, and I want to distinguish him from Judas Iscariot. Oh, I got to give him, I'm making him up, so I've got to give him a different disambiguator. You see how that works? Why would he do that? Similarly, in Acts 1, when there are these 2 men who appear only in Acts, and that's Matthias and Joseph Barsabbas. These are the 2 men who were candidates for replacing Judas Iscariot among the 12. They appear only there, okay? And those are both pretty popular names. So, again, if Luke is making them up, if the author is just inventing them, how did he come to invent these people with popular names? And in the case of Joseph Barsabbas, he even felt that he had to put a disambiguator on it. When you have these disambiguators, that's some evidence that that's how they were actually known in the community. That not only did they exist, but they were known this way. And the reason they were known this way was because otherwise it would be hard for people to tell them apart from another person by that same name. Now, there's been a recent critique published of this. So I'm going to put a link in the notes. This link is going to go to the official page with Brill publications for this article by Kamil, Gregor and Brian Blais. And you're not going to be able to just immediately download it for free. If you have institutional access, you can log in through your institution and download it, or you can pay for a full copy. I do have a full copy. And so I'm going to be kind of taking my time going through and criticizing things that I disagree with in this article. A big central point of Gregor and Blais's critique concerns sample size. There just aren't all that many people in the Gospels and Acts. I mean, even if you put them all together, they're, it's not a huge number of people. So if we imagine them as being drawn from a distribution of, let's say, actual historical people, it's still a relatively small sample. So when we ask ourselves, is it representative statistically of, sort of the real people out there, the real names in the place and time, and then our access to this is maybe from the Ilan data, as represented in her data that she collected, the smaller the sample, the less likely it is to be actually representative. We can see this by a sort of exaggerated example. If you have a fair coin, it's a fair coin, okay? It's not weighted either way. So heads and tails should be equally probable, but you only flip it 4 times. It's actually not overwhelmingly probable that you're going to get exactly 2 heads and exactly 2 tails because it's such a small sample. Where you're going to see that 50-50 heads and tails is over a much longer sample, and the bigger the sample is, the more likely it is that if the coin is fair, you will get 50-50 heads and tails. But you can get a run in there of, 10 heads in a row. That can happen, even with a fair coin. So that's why we like to have bigger samples in order to ask whether they are representative. Okay, so the fact that this is kind of a small sample makes it difficult to see how significant it is. How much information can we draw from the statistical shape of this sample? Gregor and Blais go so far as to say that it's just so small that we really can hardly tell anything. And one of the things is that they're reducing the sample size, and I'll be talking about that next time. They're taking certain people out of the consideration in the Gospels and Acts so that they start out with something of about 79 people, and then they reduce it down to 53. And since 79 wasn't that big of a sample size to begin with, then it's a pretty important thing to do. And then they're saying, whatever resemblances there are here to Ilan's data really doesn't tell us much of anything. They even compare this to a sort of hypothetical random walk where we imagine a fabricating author who's picking names at random from a pool of 454 names with just one instance of piece in there, and then he's just drawing at random, and say that that's just about as good, sometimes maybe even looks a little better than the Gospels and Acts. So that's kind of the core of their critique. And then they have a lot of other things they say, like possible ways that the Gospel and Acts authors might have known about name statistics in the real world, even though they're making people up. They even call that random 454 draw the most extreme alternative scenario, the most extreme fabricating scenario. I don't actually agree that it's the most extreme, so that's part of what I'll be talking about. I want to say a couple things. It's just a preliminary, even this whole series is just a preliminary approach. I'm hoping to get a chance to get some more specific statistical reanalysis of this material to present over the long haul. But these are things that I can see already that I think are problems with Gregor and Blais's paper. The other thing I want to say is that I really appreciate their clarity. They write in an analytical fashion. They make it clear what they're up to, what they're doing, what they're assuming, and that makes it really easy to see where we agree or disagree with their methodology. That's much better than writing vaguely or obscurely, where it's hard to even sort of get to first base to say, okay, this is what he says, this is what I say, this is where we disagree. So I appreciate that. The other thing is, when I say in the course of this series, well, they don't mention this, or they don't tell you that, about the statistics. I am not accusing anybody of being deceptive. I don't even think that they, are going out there and going, let's do it this way because that'll favor our conclusion. I think even when they make mistakes, you could call them in a sense good faith mistakes, or what I regard as mistakes, that they're not being done, deliberately to get the conclusion that they want. So I just want to make that clear up front. So next time I'm going to be talking about this issue of sample size and why certain persons that are mentioned in the Gospels and Acts are being taken out of the Gospels and Acts data before Gregor and Blais evaluate them, and why I think that's wrong and that's not the correct way to approach it. So I hope you'll enjoy this series, and I also hope, by the way, that the sound is better this time. I've been having some trouble with my sound quality lately on these videos, so I've tried to improve it this week. So please come back next time to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.